As human beings, the one constant when we're faced with the death of a loved one is the need for a time of grieving to occur. For many, they're fortunate enough to have the support, empathy, and care of family and friends. When there are tragic circumstances causing the death of another, those left behind also expect that they can rely upon the layers and systems of our society. Systems that are supposedly responsible to support them and the idea of justice. How is it then that we as a society have such broken systems that can so grossly fail people while they're alive and continue to let them down after their death, while also managing to disrespect and re-victimize the loved ones left behind trying to make sense of this all? How is it also that one man's unfounded and baseless account of his actions can continue to cause grief, hurt and confusion, as well as twist the system to cause extended and undue pain to those still looking for answers? We'll provide some clarity, although not necessarily reasoning, to these questions on this next episode of the Hillier Triple Murder, here on Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
They do go bump, obviously. My name, as you know, is Daniel Panozzo, and I'm again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel. Welcome, listeners.
Indeed, welcome to you all listening. If you haven't heard our previous episodes in this, the Hillier Triple Murder, we do recommend you go back and listen to the first two episodes on either iTunes and Spotify. And we also ask that you please rate, review and subscribe to us while you're there. Before we begin this episode, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that the following program contains the names and references to people who have died. If you find anything we discuss distressing, please make use of the following support resources: the Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368. The Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200. The Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098. Or the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800-RESPECT. Before we begin this episode, I just want to advise that this will have some graphic content and we will be providing a warning for that as we get to that part. Before we get there, however, at the end of our last episode, Sean, you told us that Stephen Peat made his initial plea in court and he pleaded guilty to the murder of Yvette Rigney. However, he then also pleaded not guilty to the deaths of Corey and Amber. And I need at this point, I think, can we pick up from there and can you elaborate for myself and the listeners, just for all of us to get an understanding around maybe the how and the what, and I'm going to be honest, the "are you kidding me" piece of this.
Are you kidding me is probably the feeling that was going through pretty much everyone in court. I think even Justice Malcolm Blue, who was presiding over what he was expecting to be a 2-week trial, had that reaction. Nobody saw this coming.
Sorry, so just quickly, so even Justice Blue there wasn't aware that this was what was going to occur?
That's right, because he was hearing the trial as a judge alone.
Right.
No jury. So if you don't know what a trial by judge alone is, listeners, please go back to our first series on the death of Jack Hanley. It's explained in depth there. Very clearly, though, this caught him off guard.
Yeah, right.
You've set aside 2 weeks to hear this very complicated matter, and you're being told, well, no, I plead guilty to a third of the allegations against me.
So what happens from there, Sean? Because as you said, we're expecting a 2-week trial. The judge is there, the defence, the prosecution, all of that's there.
The families are there.
Absolutely. Everyone's there for the start of this 2-week process. And this has just truncated all that. It's a bombshell. Now we've got a guilty to one, but not... So what do we do from here?
Justice Blue looked at Pete and said, well, in that case, I sentence you automatically to life imprisonment.
Okay, so off the back of that, immediately he can just say life imprisonment at that point.
That's right. It's the mandatory penalty for murder. You've confessed to a murder.
Yep.
You're definitely going to jail for life.
Okay.
We'll worry about your non-parole period later, but you are definitely getting a life sentence for the murder of Yvette Rigney.
So no matter what we do from here, he's pleaded guilty to that. We know he's going to jail for life.
That's right.
And we'll work out the details later. But right now we know Stephen Peat going to jail for life, guilty of 1 murder by his own admission, 2 unaccounted for.
That's right. So he turns to the prosecutor, Ryan Williams, and says, Mr. Williams, make your case. We're going to keep going with this trial.
Right.
So now it's a trial for 2 murders instead of 3.
Okay, yep.
You imagine the confusion you're feeling right now, the confusion the listeners are feeling right now is the confusion I was feeling.
Yep.
In my almost 20 years of covering courts, this was unprecedented.
Right.
I'd never seen a trial where someone pleaded guilty to a third of the allegations against them.
Okay.
For the Rigney family,
Yep.
this was obviously highly distressing.
Yeah.
They knew now that their daughter's boyfriend
Yeah.
had killed her,
Okay.
but they had no idea what the legal ramifications were about their grandchildren.
Yeah.
And the family I told you about in our last episode, the White family, who had been coming to every one of the hearings over that very long 14-month under-the-radar period,
Yes.
they were incredibly distressed.
Okay. So there's another appearance of them at this point. So look, just to, I guess, get an idea of that picture. So everyone so far at this point is rocked, fair to say?
Absolutely rocked.
And I mean, from families to yourself to the defense box, even the judge. So we've now gone from a 2-week period for 3 murders, you said, down to 2. So what happens now? What do we do from here? What does the judge do? What do we do?
With no choice,
Yeah.
prosecutor Ryan Williams stands up and makes his case, opens the case to Justice Blue as he would have originally.
Okay.
And what he says is that the motivation for these murders, as far as the prosecution alleges, is jealousy.
Oh.
And specifically, Stephen Graham Peat's jealousy towards Yvette Rigney, because, Mr. Williams alleges, Ms. Rigney had decided to leave Peat.
Okay.
Peat was infatuated with her, but she was leaving.
Right.
She was going back to a former boyfriend.
Okay.
A former boyfriend who she had spent time with the week prior to the murders. A former boyfriend who she intended to go see the day after she died. She'd made plans with this other man. Peat knew about them, and as a result, the prosecution said, that's why he killed her.
Right. So we're now getting a bit of an idea of, and I don't want to call it motive, but a reason in his mind. This is a possibly a crime of passion, jealousy, as you said. So now we've got some reference for what's going on and why.
That's right. But what we don't have is a reason for why the kids died as well.
Of course.
Because I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but adult versus adult, passion, jealousy, etc., it's inexcusable, it's intolerable, it should never, ever be countenanced. But it's understandable.
Yes.
How did 2 children die as a result of that dispute?
How are they brought into this?
That's the question that needs to be teased out. But before we even get there, there's 2 other players to introduce into this matter.
Okay.
Remember those Families SA workers that we talked about?
You'd done some investigation and they'd been in contact with the family. That's what
right.
we know so far.
The advertiser had found out that there had been Families SA workers visiting on the day
Correct.
of
That's
the murders.
Right. Yes, correct.
Families SA refused to confirm or deny that, simply saying that they had contact with the family.
Sure.
We'd heard those allegations, perhaps that Yvette had a drug problem, that the children hadn't been cared for properly. That was being investigated.
Right.
Mr. Williams comes up in court and says, well, it actually goes a step further than all of that. Families SA didn't visit them on the day of the murders.
Right.
Families SA visited them at the time of the murders.
Sorry, so Families SA were there on the property as this was occurring?
As this was occurring. From Mr. Williams' own prosecution opening, Yvette's white Statesman, her car, was in the driveway when Families SA attended. The air conditioner was on. Otherwise, things were quiet. The door was not answered, and the 2 Families SA officers left shortly after they arrived. On the prosecution case, Peat was inside and may have already killed the 3 deceased.
So from that piece of the prosecutor's information there, he's saying that Families SA had attended, and as you said, it paints the picture that the air conditioner's on, the car's in the driveway, someone is home. They've knocked on the door. You've also said it's been quiet. That's incredibly ominous to me, Sean. If I think of that, for what we know has occurred, there must have been a horrendous amount of activity, possibly noise, disruption, disturbance, all of those things. And yet, when they attended, it is ominously quiet. As, I guess at this point, horrible as this sounds so far, Sean, what does the prosecution say happened, or do they think has happened next?
What happens next, according to the prosecution, is that after families SA leave the property, so does Pete. He gets in his car and he drives to the home of a man who's now familiar to us, a man by the name of Sean Eyre.
We spoke of him last episode.
That's right. Sean Eyre is the man that he considered to be his uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Mr. Williams, Pete arrives at Eyre's house and says, "I effed up. I need you to come for a drive. I need you to help me move some things."
So this is the part we see where Pete has now gone, something's going on. I now need to cover this up. I need to do something to make this go away.
Well, that was Mr. Eyre's concern because he said, well, what do you need?
Yeah.
Pete tells him, "I really need a tarpaulin."
Mm.
And Eyre says, "Have you killed Yvette? Is she dead?" And Pete's response is, "Yeah." Eyre says to him, "Well, what about the kids? Are they at school?" And Pete says, "No." Before Mr. Eyre can react to that, Pete looks at him and says, "What's the best way to get rid of a body? Do you think I should chop it up?"
Sean, I'm almost a little bit reserved to ask this. You've just told me that Pete's asked the best way to get rid of a body, and what happens next?
According to the prosecution, they get back into Pete's car. This is Sean Eyre and Stephen Graham Pete. And they drive back to the farmhouse at Hillier. Mr. Eyre's obviously really worried about what he's going to find inside at this point, so he goes next door.
Yeah.
And goes to Sam Burnell, another familiar name to yourself and to our listeners. He's the neighbouring person.
This is the third man that we knew was at the... Yep.
That's right. And Eyre and Burnell already know each other well by this point.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes next door and says, "I need your help. I think my nephew has killed his woman and her kids."
How on earth... There's no way to prepare for someone to knock on your door and say that to you. Sorry, continue, Sean, sorry.
Mr. Burnell gets in his car, drives across the back of Pete's car, physically blocking it into the driveway, stopping it from leaving, gets out with a full head of steam. "What the F have you done? Where's them effing kids?" he says, grabbing Pete physically. Pete tells him, "They're gone." Sean Eyre jumps in. "Can we save them?" And Pete says, "No," trails off for a minute and then says, "I've strangled 2 kids and their mum." Burnell gets out his phone. He calls 000, tells them what he's heard and passes the phone to Pete.
Yeah.
Pete says, to the 000 operator, mind you, "Yes, I've killed my lady and her 2 kids this morning."
Okay, so I just want to pause for just a half a second there, not to interrupt you, Sean. We've got one man who's preempting something and therefore has driven his car to block in Pete so he can't get away.
Yep.
We've got another man distressed at wanting to know the condition of these children and can we save them? And then making the responsible decision to call 000. At which point Pete has essentially admitted to the deaths of all 3 at this stage.
And he's confessed 3 times.
Yeah.
Once to Sean Eyre, once to Sam Burnell, once to the 000 operator.
Right.
So before anybody bar Pete has stepped inside that Hillier farmhouse, there's been 3 confessions. Make sure you keep that in mind. Because remember, this is a trial at this point still.
This is the part that's rattling around the back of my head, Sean. You're now telling me he's confessed 3 times on the spot.
To killing all 3 people. And yet he's standing trial for 2.
He's standing in court saying, "I only did 1.
That's right.
Okay.
So you can imagine the confusion in the courtroom right now.
Absolutely, Sean. Absolutely.
So Sam Burnell goes inside the house at that point, and he's unable to find any bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes back out and says, "You're lying. Stop lying to us, Pete. What have you done to this family?"
Honestly, how much of a relief at that point might he possibly be feeling?
Very short-lived, because Pete's response is, "The little boy is in the back room under the tent." I choked him.
Just the location, to be able to give the location alone is just, that's got to be blood-curdling and chilling right there.
Burnell goes back into the house and he finds Corey's body. And we'll get into that in a minute. But what you need to know right now is that he comes straight back out, and this is where Pete gets his black eyes.
Right, okay.
I think you can really understand right now why Sam Burnell would haul off and punch Stephen Pete in the face a couple of times.
I think most people right now listening to this, Sean, are going, it was only a couple of times.
Now, Pete is an epilepsy sufferer. He didn't take kindly medically to being punched repeatedly in the face. So a second 000 call is made, this time to get an ambulance for Pete.
I think you're going to find, like me, Sean, there's a lot of people right now struggling to find any scrap of, I'll say, empathy or sympathy for this man and his medical condition.
Right there with you. Right there with you.
Absolutely.
So a second ambulance arrives, along with police officers, responding to the first 000 call. While the ambulance officers are treating Pete for his injuries, he says that Yvette is, and I quote, in the laundry. And then he says to these ambulance officers, I didn't mean any of this. She used to beat me up every day. She beat me up in front of my son. She hit my son. She used to beat me up, and I couldn't get away. She slashed my wrists while I was sleeping. She says she's going to kill me and kill my son. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry. I regret it. I feared for my safety. And before the ambulance officers can really, process, just as while you're reeling on this, he says, oh, and Amber's in her room under some clothes.
Hang on. So, is Pete here? And
I'm deliberately overwhelming you and the listeners with this because I want you guys to understand how it feels to have this hit you full force in the face.
I'm thinking, from a hypothetical perspective, is he looking to create some form of reasoning to excuse his behaviour? Is he genuine in those claims? And then I'm really confused because it almost feels incredibly calculated to then be able to switch gears immediately off the back of that last statement and go, and by the way, Amber's here.
Look, for my money, completely calculated. We are within hours of these killings right now. One we know is a murder at this point.
Yeah.
The other two are alleged murders at this point. We're within hours of this happening.
Yeah.
He's confessed a fourth time, but this time it's got some, let's call it legal dressing.
Yeah.
I mean, he's basically claiming to be a domestic violence victim.
That's my point, Sean.
He's blaming his own victim for her death.
This is one of the twists and the turns and the unexpected sort of avenues that this case goes down that we kind of alluded to at the very start of this series. There are a number of, for want of a better terms, rabbit holes you can go down here of just, hang on, what now? And I think this is certainly one of them.
Now, this is where the police enter the farmhouse. And they see what Sam Burnell saw. They see what caused Sam Burnell to haul off and punch Stephen Graham Pete in the face.
At this time, we just want to take a moment to advise that the next 90 seconds to 2 minutes of this program is filled with some very graphic content. And we ask that you are considerate of those who are listening to this with you, maybe in the car or at home, as the nature of this content is not necessarily appropriate for everyone and every age group. Please take caution with this. If this is something that may distress or you believe may cause distress to you or those around, please skip forward this section for about the next 90 seconds to 2 minutes.
Corey's body was beneath a play tent in his room. He'd been hog-tied at the hands and feet with cable ties. He had sticky tape wrapped around his head. He'd managed to remove some of the tape before he died, but he had injuries to his tongue, suggesting that there might have been a sock taped into his mouth for a period of time. They found Yvette next. She was found wrapped in a blanket under a mattress in the laundry. She had a cable tie cinched in around her neck. She also had a pattern of L-shaped head lacerations that were consistent with at least 6 blows from either a claw hammer or a crowbar. Amber was in her bedroom. She was up against a wall, wrapped in blankets and covered with clothing. She had cable ties around her neck, her hands, and her feet. Her head was wrapped in layers of tape, keeping a sock in her open mouth. There were also cable ties on the door of a wardrobe, the back of which had been kicked out from the inside, suggesting that those 2 kids had been fighting for their lives to the very end.
Sean, you just went through very methodically, I guess, if you like, and just explained what is nothing short of a horrific and just tragic set of events that no person ever should have to go through. It's certainly not the last few moments of anyone's life that anyone would ever deserve.
Especially not a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old.
And I can only imagine the sheer terror and fright and confusion that those children must have endured.
To jump ahead in the chronology a little bit, one of the things I'd later learn about Amber and Corey was they were happy, playful kids whose greatest joys in the world were SpongeBob SquarePants and Teen Titans Go. Silly, funny, happy cartoons. 6 years old and 8 years old. There's no way they would have had any concept or any understanding about what was being done to them and why.
Sean, I struggle to, as I'm sure many of our listeners are, to hear you go through that and not just feel the most immense sadness. And I can't even put into words what that must have been like for those listening in the courtroom that day.
There was no calm. There were tears. There were recriminations. Donna Rigney put her head on her knees and wept. The other family shook physically, crying, clinging to one another, just mouths working soundlessly, trying to process. But I think the person that summed it up best was the person sitting near Donna, another member of the Rigney family, who simply just yelled out, "You effing dog, she was a kid." I don't know if she was referring to, that person, was referring to Amber or to Yvette, but either way.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Justice Blue, to his credit, did not admonish that person. Simply let the outburst happen and then let court roll on.
How could you not? Sean, really, just if you can, in a couple of words, what impact did it have on you?
Something I say a lot, far too often, is that there's no ground floor in hell. Just when you think you've hit the absolute bottom of what you're going to hear in the courts, there's always something lower again. I'd love to say this is the first and only triple murder I've ever covered. It's not. And this was completely and utterly, indescribably horrific in its own way.
Sean, you've just taken myself and our listeners through the prosecution laying out just some of the most horrific and horrendous circumstances. And as tough as that was to hear, obviously, I also want to understand from the prosecution's perspective, what else did they have to say about the situation in the crime scene?
They said that Yvette's blood was found in several places around the house, including on a crowbar and on a metal vacuum cleaner pipe. It wasn't the only substance found on those items, though. Pete's DNA was found on those items as well, indicating that he'd held them, touched them, carrying them around. Also, his DNA was found on cable ties, sticky tape, and socks
Yep.
around the house.
Yep.
That, they said, meant that they could link him completely to the crime
Sure.
on top of his admissions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a reason they needed to do that. You'd think that DNA evidence would be enough. You'd think that those earlier admissions would be enough. But a funny thing happened, and I don't mean that in a humorous way,
Sure.
after Pete got loaded into an ambulance and taken to hospital.
Okay.
He changed his story.
Okay.
Prosecutor Ryan Williams informed the court that while he was in hospital, Pete said Amber had wet the bed and he'd carried the mattress into the laundry. Yvette had gotten mad at him and then hit him with the metal vacuum cleaner pole.
Mm.
He said Yvette had told him to get out, but he couldn't leave because he had nowhere else to go, that he loved her, that he would never hit a girl. He said he didn't remember going to Mr. Ayres' house or telling them that he'd killed anyone, and that the next thing he knew, Sam Burnell was beating him up for some reason.
So at this stage, Stephen Pete's now saying that he has, for want of a better term, no recollection, blacked out, doesn't remember the circumstances. From carrying the mattress and being hit with his vacuum pole, professing his love, next minute he's been beaten.
That's right. He says that he's got a gap in time right there.
Sure. Okay.
Of course, he got arrested. We
Mhm.
know that.
Mm.
I saw him in court with those two black eyes. After that arrest, according to the prosecution, Pete kept talking. He told a correctional services worker that Yvette had beaten him and he'd snapped, went to the children, and killed them. But he also told that worker he didn't kill Yvette.
Hang on. So now, after the fact and before court, we've got another turn of events here where now he's killed the children and not Yvette.
That's right.
So we've got a third version of this now.
Third version. And of course, Yvette died. We know that.
Yeah.
But on this version, Pete blamed Sean Eyre.
Hang on, what?
He said Sean Eyre had come back to the house with him,
Yeah.
that trip that he supposedly didn't remember,
Yeah.
and Sean Eyre, he said, falsely, had finished Yvette off.
So now he's removing himself from this and laying the blame on somebody else.
While admitting to killing the children, which at the start of this trial where we're hearing all this, he says, no, I killed the woman, I didn't kill the children.
Okay, so right now we've just got a veritable mess here, Sean, and we've got multiple stories, multiple admissions, multiple retractions of admission. We've now dragged somebody else in as the scapegoat.
Now, I want to make a couple of things clear.
Sure, please.
Pete repeated that claim that Mr. Eyre had been involved
Okay.
to a fellow prisoner who was also quite prepared to give evidence against him. Pete was not a popular person inside prison, let's put it lightly.
Oh,
Insisted Sean Eyre had done it. Now, I want to say this so that everybody out there understands this. Sean Eyre was never accused of anything, has never been accused of anything,
yeah.
is not suspected of anything.
Mm-hmm.
He is not in the gun for this at all.
Yeah.
He is an innocent man. There has never been an assertion beyond that, except from Pete's lips.
Yeah.
There is no trace of Sean Eyre's DNA anywhere in that house.
Yeah.
So do not be mistaken. Only two people entered that house and came back out alive. One was Stephen Pete.
Yep.
The other was Sam Burnell.
Yeah.
Now, Sam Burnell also not a suspect in
Sure.
anything. In fact, he's one heck of a Crown witness.
Yeah, right.
This is the lay of the land. The prosecution says all of these ridiculous stories,
Mm-hmm.
all of this DNA evidence,
Yep.
the bodies that were tragically found,
Mm-hmm.
the family's essay attendance that was unanswered, all together add up to proof beyond reasonable doubt that Stephen Pete did not just kill Yvette Rigney, as he's admitted,
Yep.
but killed Amber and Corey as well.
Sean, this is fascinating as much as it is horrifying for me. The fact that this man has done this, and then in this short space of time, has changed his story over and over, has clearly then tried to besmirch the name and the innocence of another man to cover his tracks and to remove the blame from himself.
Not to mention blaming Yvette for her own death.
Absolutely. And at this point has made some claims that he was the victim of domestic violence himself. And right now at this point, whether it is or isn't truth is not even relevant for me at this point. How, at this stage, do we move forward? So what does the prosecution do from here? How do we move forward? What is the next part of this?
Well, the prosecution at this point is ready to call evidence.
Yeah, right.
It's going to call Sam. It's going to call Sean Eyre. It's going to bring in those families' SA workers. It's going to bring in the evidence that backs up everything they've just said. Because you've got to remember, that's an opening statement for a trial.
This is my point as well.
These are all just allegations at this point.
Sure. No doubt the defence has got some sort of opening statement or
Well, it's
response?
interesting because the defence decided to stump up right then.
Okay.
Pete had barrister Bill Boko,
Sure.
one of the most respected defence barristers in the state.
Okay.
And Bill Boko said, Your Honour, before we go any further, I just need to raise the fact that my client was an automaton when the children died and was therefore mentally incapable of forming the intent to murder.
Sorry, hang on, Sean. So we've got the mental capability piece again, but you just used a term, and you used it last episode, automaton.
That's right.
So can you help us out here and explain what that means and how that might relate to this circumstance and this trial?
Well, let Bill Boko explain it to you.
Sure.
Because we'd already been caught off guard once.
Absolutely.
Here we are being caught off guard a second time.
Uh-huh.
Hang on, what? He's an automaton? And this is what Bill Boko said. I don't want to interrupt the smooth passage of this trial, but there's a psychological diagnosis which fits the profile of persons who are the victim of domestic violence over a period of time. It was not my intention to inject mental health into this. I've been looking at it from the point of view of old-fashioned, non-insane automatism. We as a defence team question my client's ability to form intent and how the mind was working following a traumatic event. Have you heard of a dissociative state?
I have heard of that, yes.
So someone basically leaves their body consciously. The body continues to act and do things, but the conscious brain is no longer in the driver's seat.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
no longer responsible. What Bill Boko is saying here is Yvette committed an act of violence upon Pete. Pete snapped, took leave of his body mentally. His body continued on, committed these crimes, and he came back to himself and conscious thought and rational thought and memory around the time that Sam's fists landed in his eyeballs.
So a violent repercussion has brought this man back to his conscious state.
Cognitive recalibration, they call it.
Recalibration's one word for it. Recalibrated the probably the hue and the color scheme of his face a little bit by the sounds of it. This account here has essentially given some credence of some description, if you like, to possibly Stephen Pete not having that mental capability or capacity we talked about to be held responsible for the actions he has numerous times admitted to actually being responsible for.
That's right, because under South Australian law, to commit a crime, you have to be aware of the fact that you have broken the law or that your actions could be interpreted as being a break of the law.
Sure.
If you know that you shouldn't be speeding and you speed anyway, you're committing a crime.
Yeah.
If you have a mental illness or any other condition that means at that time you're not thinking straight, and I'm not talking about intoxication here, that's a different kettle of fish.
Absolutely.
But if you are incapable of understanding that putting your foot to the floor and going over the speed limit is a crime, you are not guilty of that crime by reason of mental incompetence. What the defence is setting up right here and right now is that Pete criminally killed Yvette, which is a murder, knew that it was wrong to kill her, knew that it was a breach of the law, did it anyway, and in that moment, psychologically, mentally left his body, tied up, and killed those two kids, and then drove to Sean Eyre's house and didn't come back to himself until he was punched. They're saying that that very detailed, very planned out, very restrictive manner of murdering two children was done by someone who was on automatic pilot.
Yeah, see, so Sean, as you're saying that, and I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure along the same lines as you. This is the fact that you've gone and driven to get someone else to help you dispose of, get rid of these bodies, to cover this up, to me shows intent that you knew what you had done was not right.
You're not alone in thinking that, because Justice Blue said, all right, if your client is in a dissociative state and you say you've got a psychological report to that effect, I'd like to see it, please.
Sure.
Bill Boko's response was, no.
Sorry, what?
He said no.
How can he refuse that report?
He said, I'll consider doing it, and I don't wish to be churlish, but no, because under the law of this state, Your Honour, once the issue of automatonism is raised, it is the prosecution who bears the onus of disproving it. Hence, he says, my reluctance to, as it were, shed all the covers and put everything on the table. At law, if you claim you're out of it, you don't have to prove you're out of it. The prosecution has to disprove that you are out of it.
Sean, I'm going to call that far more than just churlish. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm struggling to understand where on earth this is going to go next. Sean, I just said to you that I have no idea where this is going to go next. And I was a little afraid to ask earlier, and I'm not sure I'm any braver right now, but please, where do we go next?
When you're a prosecutor faced with a sudden and unexpected automaton defense, and you're told that at law it's your job to disprove it, not the other way around, there's only one thing you can do.
Right.
You politely ask for an adjournment.
Yeah, okay.
And if you're a judge, like Justice Malcolm Blue, as experienced a jurist as he is, you grant that application, because there's nowhere this trial can go now. You need to go speak to the experts. You need to go get some psychologists, some psychiatrists, some mental health experts on side, and get them to explain to you where you go next and what your options are.
How utterly bewildering and frustrating must this be for both the prosecution, the judge, not just those two, I shouldn't say both, the families, everyone that's sitting there. How incredibly just frustrating, on top of being distraught probably from what they've just heard, must this be for everyone involved?
The word that came to my mind at the time for that, and still sticks with me to this day, is debilitating.
Yeah, great. No, absolutely.
You build yourself up, you steel yourself, you get ready for this trial.
Yeah.
This is going to be the next 2 weeks of your life. You're going to hear some stuff that you don't want to hear. You're going to have to think about the people you love in horrible situations.
Yep.
But at the end of it, you're going to get an outcome. You're going to get a result. And oh, wait, it's just all been snatched away from you by something that you had no clue existed in this case, let alone in South Australian law.
Sure, I'm struggling to put my head around that and understand that. Debilitating is incredibly apt, as far as I'm concerned, from what you've said. To have to go away and do this, and as you said, this is day one. Let's be honest. We thought it was going to be a 2-week trial, but this is day one of anything.
Well, we didn't even get really to day one. This is morning one. You know, this has all happened in the space of an hour and a half.
So we're at morning tea by now.
Morning tea, maybe lunchtime if you're lucky. So there's Donna Rigney and the rest of her family leaving court. Donna and I, as you know, had gotten along very well to this point. Mm-hmm. Donna just had no words. She had nothing to say.
Unbelievable. Understandable.
She just politely held up her hand and just shook her head and walked past me. And of course, you accept that. The other family, they left as well.
Yep.
Everybody filed out. Nobody really knew where to go next or what to do. The prosecution were straight back to the main DPP building to try to figure themselves out. Defense team leave as well.
Yeah.
They've done their job.
Right.
They've really done their job. Now, right now, you're looking at the potential, okay, my client is going down for one murder.
Yep.
He may not be going down for 2 more.
Yeah, okay. So it's a successful morning for them.
Very successful morning for them. And I come back to the advertiser building and I have to try to explain it to my bosses.
Yeah.
who react the way you have,
Yep.
the way that I'm sure our listeners are reacting right now, the
Yep.
way the families reacted. So I actually wrote a piece for the advertiser to explain the law,
Yep.
to explain everything we've just talked about, where it's going next,
Yep.
and to try to figure out what my next move was going to be.
So the adjournment, did they say what length of time is this adjournment for?
Just for a couple of days. Just a
Okay.
couple of days for the prosecution to get some sort of idea
Okay.
about where they're going to go next.
Right, okay. So they get a couple of days to get their heads together around that. You write this article. What do you do next? What happens?
I get ready for the next date. I mean, at this point, for all I know, they're going to come back and say, yeah, we're going to have a psychologist ready on the following Monday. We'll be ready to kick off Monday.
Okay.
That's not what happened.
Right.
Instead, when we got back to court, Mr. Williams asked for an adjournment until January of the following year.
So just to get some idea of continuity, we're talking, it's August?
It's August 2017.
Yep.
We're now adjourned until January 29th, 2018.
So as you said, 6 months. Again, another layer of how do you mentally navigate, prepare and cope with that. You were expecting a 2-week trial, which seemed, let's be honest, I'll say relatively cut and dry. There is a man here who technically is alleged for these 3 murders. You don't think how could this go anywhere but, and yet now we've got a 6-month time span of what do you do as a family? What do you do, Sean?
Well, Daniel, you're making an assumption there.
Right.
You're making an assumption, and the same one that I made,
Yeah.
that the families even know this is happening.
Sorry, what?
So when I found out this adjournment happened,
Yeah.
I was sitting in court listening to the first one.
Right.
The second hearing,
Yeah.
at which the January date was set, happened in closed court.
So-
Only prosecution and defence and the judge in attendance.
So at this stage, the families don't even know this.
I didn't know it until I rang the court and said, hey, what was the outcome of that hearing? Expecting to hear next week, maybe next month. Instead, I get told January.
Okay. Right.
So as a journalist, my first question is, well, how do the families feel about that?
Yep.
Because I've made the natural assumption, like you did,
Yeah.
the families know about this.
Yeah.
They've all been informed. I'll give them a call. I try to speak to the Rigneys. And Donna's not interested in talking.
Okay.
More than fair enough. She answers my call, but very politely says, Sean, I'm not talking about this.
Yep.
My mind turns to that other family.
Right.
They've turned up every hearing.
Mm-hmm.
They were at all the hearings that the Rigneys weren't at.
All
And
right.
I'm starting to wonder who these people are. I do some digging, and I discover an article by one of our rival publications that I missed. It turns out that the man and the woman who turned up to every single one of those hearings was a man by the name of Stephen Egberts and his partner, Janet Wells.
Okay. So this is an unexpected, unknown piece of another part of the puzzle.
Stephen Egberts is Corey and Amber's paternal grandfather.
Oh, dear God.
He's spoken once, and once only, to a rival outlet immediately after the murders.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's ever reached out to him again. Nobody's ever spoken to him again. So I thought the best thing that I could do is try to track this person down and find out whether they wanted to speak. I made contact with his partner, Janet, first. Now, she is not the children's biological grandmother,
Yeah.
but she is, to all intents and purposes, their grandmother. She grandmotherly raised them.
Right.
She's always been a part of their lives.
Absolutely. Okay.
So Janet is, to all intents and purposes, Nana.
Mm-hmm.
I speak to Janet first. I explain who I am, explain what I'm all about, explain that I was at court, that I've seen them, apologise for not having spoken to them previously and approached them previously, didn't know who they were. Would they like to talk about the adjournment until January? Janet's response is, what adjournment till January?
Yeah.
My heart sinks. So it falls to me to tell the grandmother of 2 murdered children that the trial is not resuming for 6 months. Distraught's too small a word for Janet's reaction. She dissembled in front of me over the phone. She passes the phone to Steve. Steve is a very strong human being.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk more about Steve as this goes on. It was like talking to broken glass. Hearing him shatter when I said the trial's off for another 6 months.
Yeah.
Steve flew into a volcanic outpouring of anguish, of rage, of absolute disgust that I didn't expect. Because Steve was angry about something I hadn't even gotten an inkling of. Steve said, "That's it. I have no more faith in this justice system and no more faith in these prosecutors who keep misleading us."
Hang on a second.
I went, "What?" He said, "Yep. Appalling lack of empathy showed by these people, no interest in us, and the way they've treated us has cost me and my family our sanity."
Sean, with that, another twist and turn and bombshell here. And sorry, a man's family and sanity, and another element you weren't even aware of. We're going to pick this up again in our next episode. I just want to go through that process, though, and just for you, Sean, in that moment, how does it feel once again to have to be the messenger that unpacks this sort of thing to people going through this?
I spoke about it in our last series, The Death of Jack Hanley, and I have to say it again. This is not supposed to be my job.
No.
I'm not supposed to be the messenger for this sort of thing.
Absolutely not.
And here we are again. Here we are in that exact same situation again. But it gets worse. Because what would happen next, Daniel, convinced me that this family had been so poorly treated that I could no longer separate where the systemic failure started and finished, because it occurred before and after the deaths of these poor kids.
Sean, it's going to be, if this hasn't been already a tough ride, it's going to be a very tough ride through our next episode. Before we get there, as always, we just want to remind you that if you have found anything in this episode or any of these episodes so far that you have found distressing, please make use of the following support resources, as we said at the start of the show as well. The Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368. The Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200. Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098. The National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800-RESPECT, or in your state and or country where you might be, whatever relative services offer that same support to you as well. At the end of this episode, I want to thank everyone who has been through this ordeal and listened to everything we've said on this episode. We can't express our gratitude and thanks enough for all the kind words, feedback and regard we get. We'd absolutely love to have you give us more of that, whether you hear the show over the broadcast at 5AA or you catch the podcast on both iTunes and Spotify. Please, if you haven't already, go there, rate, review, leave us some feedback. We do value everything that's given to us. Until then, if you do want to follow the exploits of the true crime here in Adelaide, you can do that, of course, through Sean's work with The Advertiser or at Sean Fuster on both Instagram and also Facebook. Of course, we are at Just Lawful Podcast on both Instagram and Facebook, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. And until we pick this story up again, please enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you next time on the next episode of Just Lawful.